Good evening, everyone. It's such a great pleasure and honor being back here in Athens. I grew up in Italy, where I spent more than 20 years, and I visited Greece for vacation and otherwise for many years. And I know the country is a beautiful country, it's a beautiful city. I have many friends here in this country, and I care about this country. So whatever I'm going to say tonight is a friend, somebody who realizes that there are extreme economic difficulties. 20% unemployment, 50% among young people, a recession is becoming a depression, and therefore the question is what to do to get out of it, because this is not a sustainable situation. So I'll make a few points. The first point is that after even the recent debt restructuring agreement and the new agreement for a bailout package with the Troika, and it's not a bailout because it's another 130 billion euros of debt that's going to be borrowed by the Greece and had to be paid back. The official estimate suggests that the public debt of Greece is going to be, in 2020, in the best scenario, 120% of GDP. And if the scenario is going to be negative, could be 160% of GDP. So even after that restructuring, even after this program, the debt is still at a level that is not sustainable. Second point about this debt restructuring, a 50% reduction of the debt held by the private sector. People say this is voluntary, this is not a default. We're discussing whether Greece should default, but it is a default because, one, it is coercive. It's like somebody coming with a gun to your head and saying, give me 50% of your wealth or reduce my debt by 50%, otherwise I'll shoot you. There's nothing voluntary about it. It's done under coercion. Secondly, rating agencies are going to consider it as a default. They're going to rate the country in selective default. Three, even after this debt restructuring, many of the creditors don't want to accept it. They'll be holding out. And therefore, the government is going to pass legislation to force this debt restructuring on those who are holdouts. That's like a default. And four, because of this forced restructuring that imposed on everybody to have 100% participation, this is going to trigger these credit default swaps. This is going to be considered as a credit event. So if it walks and quacks like a default duck, is a default. So we're not discussing whether it's going to be default or not. This is a default. The question is, can we restore sustainability of the debt of the country? Now, in terms of restoring that sustainability, the medicine of the Troika, that is austerity and structural reform, however necessary, makes the recession worse. If you have to raise taxes, if you have to reduce pensions, if you have to reduce minimum wages, if you reduce transfer payments, if you have to reduce government spending, you're reducing demand, you're reducing the disposable income of workers, and even the IMF study suggests that fiscal austerity makes the recession worse. So it's a vicious circle. There was a recession, the deficit becomes larger, you raise taxes, you cut spending, the deficit becomes bigger because there is more recession, and now you're in this vicious circle, it's becoming worse. Even the structural reforms in the short run make the recession worse. People say you have to flexibilize the labor market. That's good news. But then what? You're going to fire hundreds of thousands of public employees. You're going to fire hundreds of thousands of private employees. You have to shut down thousands of firms that are unprofitable. All these things imply more recession. So the debt dynamic is going to get worse because you're trying to stabilize and reduce your debt as a share of your GDP. But if this austerity makes your GDP and output keep on falling more, your debt ratio is going to become more and more larger, even if you're trying to reduce your deficit. So this debt dynamic becomes unsustainable. That leads me to the main point. The austerity program stresses austerity. What the country needs is growth. That's the fundamental issue, that you have to restore sustainability. So the country doesn't have only a problem of a stock of debt that is excessive, it has also a problem that there is no economic growth, output is falling more and more, there has been a loss of competitiveness externally because wages were growing more than productivity, unit labor costs were rising, and goods in Greece became more expensive relative to imports, and because of that the trade deficit become larger and larger, and now the private sector doesn't want to finance it. So you have to restore growth, you have to restore competitiveness, you have to restore external balance. So even after you restructure your debts, you're not going to have economic growth. And if you don't get the economic growth, you're going to be in a situation not sustainable. The question is how you restore growth and competitiveness and external balance. Everybody agrees that you need to have a real depreciation. That means your exports become cheaper, your imports become more expensive, so that your trade balance improves. There are only 4 ways in which you can achieve a real depreciation. Either by miracle, the euro falls in value relative to the US dollar by another 30%, Or you're going to do structural reforms, but even in Germany, those structural reforms increase competitiveness over 10 years. If you start today, you're not going to see benefits for 5 years. The third option is deflation, reduce prices and wages over the next few years by 30%. But that deflation is also associated with a recession, becomes a depression, like in Argentina. So that doesn't work. So if the euro is not going to be devalued to parity, if competitiveness and structural reform take too long, if deflation is destructive of economic activity, there is only one other option that is painful but is necessary one: devaluation. Going back to the drachma, exiting the eurozone, having a significant depreciation is going to lead to more exports of tourism, of other goods, and reduction of the imports. And therefore, while domestic demand is going to be weak, consumption is falling in the private and public sector, the way you restore growth is by improving your net exports, your trade balance, and for that one you need a depreciation. And the only way to achieve this depreciation is going to be to exit the eurozone and going back to the drachma. Otherwise, you're not going to have economic growth. Otherwise, you're going to have a depression for the next few years. So that leads me to the other point. Of course, there's going to be collateral damage if you're going to exit the eurozone. I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, but it can be managed. You can have an agreement with the Troika on the exit, an agreement on how much the currency should depreciate so there is not an overshooting, an agreement to try to have official financing so that you don't end up in high inflation, an agreement to recapitalize your banks so there is not a run on your banks, an agreement on how much and how to convert your assets and your liabilities that are in euro into new drachma. All these things can be negotiated, and official money can be used not to avoid the unavoidable, but to help and make sure that the exit is going to be orderly rather than disorderly. And my final point is the following one. The options here are not between having exit or having a situation that's going to be better. The option is between exit and having a recession that's going to become a depression. It's going to last for another 5 years after the last 5 years of a recession. So those are the two options that you have to think about. And what are the best options? To go through a depression that's going to become severe, it's going to lead to more social backlash, political backlash, more strikes, more demonstration, more riots, more violence, or accept the medicine, have a significant exit that's going to restore your competitiveness, you're going to restore your economic growth. In 3 months after the devaluation and default by Argentina, Argentina was falling 20% annualized their output. 3 months later, after default and depreciation, they started to grow 8%, have been growing 8% for the last decade. So you can restore growth, incomes, jobs, and that's what is necessary. So that's the option that you're facing right now. And some people say that if you exit the eurozone, the drive for reform, structural and otherwise, is not going to be there. That's not true. To do reform, you need economic growth. If there's going to be a recession that becomes a depression, then the backlash against that austerity and those reforms is going to be more significant. If you have economic growth, it's easier to do structural reform with economic growth. You cannot do structural reforms when you have 20% unemployment, 50% among the young, and the situation socially and politically is becoming more and more unstable. So unfortunately, the restructuring is already coercive, is effectively default, more of it will have to occur, and eventually the country will have to decide to exit to restore growth and competitiveness. That's the way to go ahead.